Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and particularly our foreign delegates. Welcome to Singapore, and I hope you have an enjoyable stay in Singapore. Now, this morning, as Ken Lim mentioned, we are really honored and pleased to have a minister with us. Now, he has, particularly as a foreign minister, is keen to get some insight, some views, particularly from our foreign delegates. What the kind of events that are happening over there, and what are the impacts and significant that it may have in your country and also in other part of Asia Pacific. And of course, for our own local participant, many of you will know that prior to joining politics, our ministers is one of the top litigators in Singapore, involved in many MNCs issues and disputes and so on. And then, in fact, one of the youngest lawyers to be appointed senior counsel in Singapore. So many of you would like to pick his brain, get his views and insight on some of the issues that perhaps concern you. So before we start with this very informal dialogue session, just a small little procedural thing that I would want to put in. We will try to encourage as many of you to participate, and therefore we may have to limit the number of questions that each one of you want to ask. And also, when you raise your question, it will be useful if you can just mention your name, the company that you come from, and also the country, right? That will give us a good idea where you come from. So without much ado, I would now like to open the discussion to the floor. Is that anyone, or you want to say something first?
Not really. I'm happy to take questions.
Okay. Is there anyone who would like to start?
My approach is I'm very open to any range of questions, whether it's real estate or other factors, local or foreign. If I can answer, I'll answer. If I can't, I'll tell you I can't answer. Okay. So let's take a sort of fairly informal, broad approach.
Right.
But at the end of it, we both must go away feeling that we have had a good session where our knowledge has improved.
As usual, the room's a little bit quiet, and as a moderator, I would start asking the first question. I think many of us, particularly in Singapore and also maybe overseas, we have heard recently our minister have gone to the United States, in Washington, when he made some comment on the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership that we are talking about. But some of us may not be too familiar with what this TPP is all about. Perhaps maybe we can ask the minister to just share with us very briefly what is this concept here and how with this TPP it could benefit people in the Asia Pacific country in terms of maybe doing business, investment, and so on.
Well, the fundamental idea of the TPP is free trade. So you look at the countries that can potentially be involved in it, the largest economy in the world, the third largest economy in the world, Japan. Then you have Canada coming in. You have Australia. You have a number of countries from ASEAN, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei. You have few other countries, and eventually we hope from a Singapore perspective that China will be in it. But even as it currently stands, spanning across the Pacific, this region, don't forget, is looking at 40% of the world's GDP. A regime, as the TPP is, which focuses on being a very high quality free trade agreement, providing for better movement of goods, services, people-to-people connections, increasing connectivity, making it easier for trade, requiring higher standards, can really be a booster for GDP growth and economic growth, GDP growth for the entire region. Trade simply means you need to become more competitive. One cannot win in everything. There will be areas where one country is better, areas where another country is better, and this maximizes that kind of comparative advantages And in the end, all sides prosper. So we were one of the original initiators of the TPP. It's a little known, but it originally started with ourselves, Australia, Brunei, Chile. And the US came in, and we had the TPP in place. We had that arrangement, but other than Australia and New Zealand, the others were relatively small economies, right? And open trading system. Now, of course, the entire game has changed with the US coming in, Canada coming in. It's a very different ball game. But if it takes off, and the fact that TPA has been approved by US Congress makes the prospects of TPP moving ahead much better. And when I was in Washington, 3 weeks ago, there was a question of whether Congress will give TPA to the president. And in fact, it had been voted down, and we made some remarks about what that meant for the US position in Asia. But thankfully, that got sorted out. And we are very hopeful. If it comes through, I think you can take it that economic growth, this will be a further booster for economic growth.
Okay. Thank you. Any question from floor?
I think you're Singaporean. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi.
Okay. Please use a mic.
Hi. My name is Webster. I'm the CEO for Web Realtors. I'm here.
Yes, I can see you.
Hi. Okay. Going sirs. It's reported that the government is going to review the cooling measures that's been placed for the last few years. I think probably it might help us, but what's your view? And what are the measures that they will be reviewing, and possibly would they also invite investors to come back to buy our properties? Because apparently I think the luxury market has really been on the downtrend. Thank you.
I can give you a lawyer's answer, which is that we are always reviewing it, but I'm sure that's not the answer you want. Every real estate convention I go to, and I've been to a few, the question that all the agents ask me, ask the other ministers is, when are you going to lift it? I'll tell you the factors. I am in no position to make a decision or tell you an answer today because A, it's market sensitive, and B, I don't have the authority, right? But I think for you to understand, what you need to know is what are the factors that drive the government's decision. And that's information that I can share with you. There are fundamentally, I would say, 3 factors. The first and foremost is what makes sense, and whether the prices are in line with sort of income growth, because you don't want a housing bubble. A housing bubble in an economy like Singapore will have serious implications to the rest of the economy, the real economy, as well as the financial economy. Pretty obvious. And related to that, second, you don't want too much of borrowing which goes into real estate, and there was a serious risk of that developing, which is why then you have TDSR and so on, because people are overgeared, and if the banks are over-lending to the property sector, when the crash comes, as it definitely will have to in such a situation, your banks are in trouble and your people are in trouble. And in the end, that's not healthy for any of you here, because that is a serious destruction of value and a serious destruction of jobs, and it will put us back many, many, many years. And there was a risk. If you recall, the government put in a series of measures, but the exuberance was such that none of those really worked, because the market kept going up and was going up in a way that seemed to many neutral people as unsustainable. It's a question of judgment as to whether we are at the right sweet spot, and there is always a risk that you overdo it and you overshoot your measures or you undershoot, and the market don't exactly stay in a sweet spot either. They tend to overreact one way or the other. The third point I will make, and that's a political point, is this. And I'll give you this, I'll explain it by reference to an anecdote. When I became Minister for Foreign Affairs in 2011, I had a town hall session, something like this, but with my young MFA officers, all in their 20s, 30s. So one young man stood up, he was about 27 at that time, 26, 27. He said, you know, Minister, I'm a president scholar. He was a president scholar, you know, pretty much creme de la creme. He had gone to Yale and had come back, high flyer. I mean, if you were to say he's not top 10%, he's not top 1%, he's probably top 0.01%. So he says, I drive around, I go by Katong. The flats cost more than $1 million. Who are you building these flats for? I'm Singaporean, I can't afford them. Now, the majority of Singaporeans are not amused when the prices go up beyond what they think they can afford. Of course, I made the point to him that probably in no city in the world, at the age 27, a young man will be thinking of buying a private apartment in one of the most desired areas. I mean, we are talking about Katong, right? So in a sense, the expectations in Singapore have come to a stage where at 28, they are looking at that. Usually, in 1-2 generations ago, you would say, look, let me start off living with my parents or start off with a HDB flat. The government gives you a big subsidy. You get at least $100,000, $150,000 from the government because when you sell after 5 years, that's the kind of money you will make. Use that, do something, and then you will buy, probably in the suburbs, and then you move up. If you happen to be a little bit more fortunate and you are on a very, very high income trajectory, maybe in your mid-30s, you could afford something beyond $1 million. But young people in their 20s in most cities don't talk about buying something in excess of $1 million. But he was looking at it, that's the aspiration. And you go down the scale, people who are, say, who are in a slightly different track also have very high aspirations. So the real question, the political question for the government is, yes, the private properties are there, but are they being built for foreigners or are they being built for Singaporeans? And we have to answer that question. The question has been answered by the government in this way, that we have to be open for investments because the knock-on effects of foreign direct investment into our property sector, it's very difficult to explain politically. Because politically, all the opposition has got to say is, you see these prices, they are sky high. You see the foreigners cavorting in Sentosa and so on. It drives up the envy factor, not just in Singapore. It drives up the envy factor in New York. It drives up the envy factor everywhere. They have got it, I don't have it. That's not the kind of conversation we used to have in Singapore. In Singapore, we used to have a conversation where he's got it. If I work hard, I can also have it. Some people are turning that conversation now into, he's got it, I don't have it, why is he having it? So we have to point out that the reason why Singapore has been successful is because people were prepared to work hard. And he has it, you will have a fair shake in getting it. We have to say that, and at the same time, we have to remain open for foreign investment. We have to remain open for foreign investment into our not landed property, I'm very strict about that, but into high-rise developments. But at the same time, we cannot allow the pricing to be such that it's inaccessible to the Singaporeans who are aspiring to it reasonably. So that's a balance. Have we gotten the balance right? Have we gotten the balance wrong? And the livelihood of estate agents is one factor that we have to consider. The banking sector is another factor. The aspirations of, we hope that 30% of our population, if more if possible, can have private property. Their aspirations have to be taken into account, and we cannot allow the prices to rise in such a way that it goes beyond what's reasonably possible for our people to buy. So it's a complex mix, and that's what we're dealing with. And ultimately, if we get it right, it's better for you, because a sustainable market supported by the broad population, that's essential for political stability. This is too small a place. If there is no political stability, ultimately your real estate prices will be such that no investor will want to invest anyway. The only way in which foreign investment will come in is if this place continues to be successful, it continues to be stable, people know that there is no unfair acquisition, people know that the law minister who is in charge of land doesn't zone certain areas because his friends are going to buy, and zoning is clear, and the ministers don't decide. This happens everywhere other than Singapore. Why is all land under me? For one reason, I'm the only ministry that doesn't use land. MND uses land, MINDEF uses land, everybody else uses land. So in his wisdom, Mr. Lee and Mr. Eddie Barker decided, put it under Ministry of Law as a neutral party, and they will decide who gets it. So SLA is under me. But we are very careful about zoning. We're very careful about valuations. Chief valuer decides, I don't decide. Zoning, it's clear, it's transparent, no changes, no ex post facto taxation. So people are prepared to put their money down. We will keep to that. As to specific financial rules, up or down, I'm not going to go into that. Yeah.
Thank you.
But you can imagine that as long as we get it right, supply and demand, I know supply is sort of overhanging, but ultimately you get it right, the real driver of price is economic growth. We get that right, the prices will rise.
Thank you. I hope that satisfied the person who asked a question. Is there another? You want to ask another question? Oh, okay.
Hello, good morning, Minister Shanmugam. Don Hong, Singaporean, but I own a Remax franchise in Bangkok. Saudi Cup, that's a Thai greeting. A quick question for you to seek your views about the ASEAN Economic Community, the progress of this AEC, and in particular, what are the implications on property investments across borders in the ASEAN sector, as well as the impact on flows of people with respect to the progress of the AEC. And I think it's supposed to be launched at end of this year, ready by end of this year, but I doubt CSC can happen. Yeah, thank you.
Look, I'm personally very bullish about the ASEAN Economic Community. Why? Today, ASEAN is the 7th largest economy in the world. 650 million people, an economy of 2.4 trillion. Within 5 years, it will go to $4 trillion. $4 trillion is something like the Japanese economy today, the 3rd largest economy in the world. So we are on a very strong growth trajectory. And the fact that both India and China are moving ahead economically, India is growing at 7%, China is growing at 7%, and those are huge economies, is a huge booster. And now the special relationship that has been forged between Singapore and Australia, I think, will help Australia come in more into the ASEAN market. And so you look at Australian economy, that's another $2 trillion. So a lot of people look at China, India, Japan, but they forget that ASEAN is a huge economy by itself with tremendous potential. And if you can integrate, now we are not going to integrate politically because we have very different political systems. We are not going to be able to integrate in a way where people-to-people movement is such that, like the EU, you can go to any country and stay, because the disparities in living standards and disparities in wages are such that, you know, some countries will then end up attracting a huge amount of migration, which is not possible to absorb. So we can't look at that. But what we can look at is combining the factors of production. You locate your factory in one place, you raise capital in another, you get legal and advisory and business services from one place, and you look at the whole as one combined business unit and also make it much easier for people to travel. There's going to be a huge amount of infrastructure development, which always is good news for real estate. You know, China has put up $100 billion under the AIIB. They've put another $40 billion under the Maritime Silk Route venture. Japan is coming up with $110 billion in terms of infrastructure developments in this region. Of course, they are competing with each other, but you know, that's in a way healthy competition from our perspective. So imagine Singapore to KL, if the HSR comes through, and Singapore to Kunming, all the way there is a rail connection, and the ports are upgraded across the region, the airports are upgraded, there's a much greater level of connectivity. I mean, today people don't think twice about going to Koh Samui or Phuket. You know, it's like taking a car and going. I mean, 2 hours you're there, 2.5 hours, and it's a few $100 up and down. So there is a lot going for us as long as there is political stability. Unfortunately, that's one thing that is a little bit of a question mark across the region, right? Other than, as what Mr. Lee calls, an oasis in Singapore. So we need, and we have to hope that that political stability comes back. It's not just 1 or 2 countries, quite a few countries which need to sort out their political system. But subject to that, I'm very bullish. Now, in terms that, what will that do in broad macroeconomic terms? That's going to drive up the wealth, particularly if TPP comes through in the region. It's going to drive up the middle class. And you know what that does? It means that property prices will go up. Specific countries, specific investments, you and I know real estate sometimes is not the most liquid of investments. So you've got to look at the country you're investing in, the rules, and the level of transparency. You know, those are issues that you need to make an assessment of. But in broad terms, I think this region is set for a liftoff.
Is anyone ask question? Maybe I ask another.
I think the fact that I said I can't answer on the cooling measures means that everybody is, you know, okay, there are no other questions.
You know, recently, in fact, last month,
but somebody just told me they're all hoping that after the elections it will be taken off. But I don't know why people link it to the elections. You know, these cooling measures came in a long time ago. They either make sense or they don't make sense. And elections by itself is not a factor. What is the state of the economy, the state of supply and demand, the state of the prices, and the linkage to wages. Those are the factors. Government is not, I can assure you, not overly linked up with elections, per se, because elections come and go, but you've got to make sure that with a 90% property owning country, 80% of whom are in public housing, 10% are in private housing, you've got to make sure you get your property sector judgment correct. And if you go and do things on election cycles, then you will lose the next elections.
No, I was saying last month I was in Beijing attending an international real estate conference. And of course, the audience are all estate agent, brokers, and salesperson. But they are foreign delegates. And one of the New York brokers was sharing with us that the Chinese investors are now almost in every part of the world, you know, buying up properties and so on. And then she mentioned that one of the New York hotel, that's the Waldorf Astoria, was sold for $2 billion. And then the Chinese investors are buying flats and apartments in different parts of the United States for their children who are studying in the United States. Because I think all of us know that China is a good potential for investment fund and also a place where we could invest. But what I would like to ask the ministers is, let's look at another country, and that country I was thinking is India. I think many of us know India is the next populous country. In fact, estimates have shown that in a very few years' time, India will overtake China in terms of the most populous country in the world. Minister, you have, in your role as a foreign minister, have been traveling to certain parts of India, visiting cities and provinces. What is your view on the potential in this different part of India in terms of investment, in terms of business opportunity, and also are there any pitfalls or something that we have to look at, the issues that maybe will concern us if we want to put in our money or investment into in India?
See, I'm not an expert on the Indian real estate market, but this is what strikes me about India. When you talk about India, you're talking about many different Indias. It's very difficult to talk about one India. There is one India in concept, but in terms of economy, there are many different Indias. There is the India that manufactures at world-beating standards. And then there is the India where literacy rates are in sub-Saharan African standards. There is the India that has got universities which are more difficult to get into than Harvard, and where the students are really gold mines of brilliance. And then there is the India where infant mortality is again at sub-Saharan standards or worse. So you're talking about different Indias. But the population and the general cultural background is such that the restrictions on Indian economy growing are being removed slowly. And with the current government, that movement has quickened. They've just passed another 5-6 bills in one sitting. But though the key piece of reform on land still hasn't been moved because of blockage in the upper house, I think what you will find is that huge supply of land, but the fact that there is a huge population by itself is not going to be a driver, because it depends on how well that population is educated, how economically literate and successful that population is. But you will find that specific states which are adopting a competitive attitude, modernizing, moving ahead, attracting investments. There are some states in India, and remember, each of those states has got a population of 40, 50, 60, 70 million. So we are talking about decent-sized countries when you talk about a state. Some of them are growing at 15%. Some of them are growing at over 10%. And there are some that are growing at 4 or 5%. So if you choose a state which is well-run, relatively good transparency, and growing at about 14, 15%, then I think there is no magic to real estate in that sense, in that with those kinds of growths, ultimately real estate prices have to go up. I don't know whether foreigners are allowed to invest. Those are not areas that I'm aware of. But in macroeconomic terms, that has got to happen. But the usual caveats are, can you invest? And if you invest, can you take your money out? That I wouldn't be able to answer. But you could direct that to some of your Indian counterparts who are here.
What about participants from other countries? You would like to ask any question?
Yeah, I have a question here.
Yeah. Okay.
So I have actually 2 questions, if it's not a problem.
You're from?
Italy, but I work in Singapore Remax. Oh. So the first question is about what happens in Greece at the moment. Do you think can have any impact on the Asian real estate market? And also with the euro.
Right. You said you had 2 questions, or one?
Yeah, and the second one is about what's happening in the stock exchange in Shanghai. Last year, they have a growth of 150%, and from last month, they start falling 35%. And so I'm just asking if this is something that we have to worry about in Asia.
Okay, let's start with Greece and the European Union. I get the sense that in terms of markets, many people are now beginning to factor in a possible exit of Greece. And in relative terms, in economic terms, it's not a very large economy. So the actual economic impact, I think, has been considered, probably factored in, and probably discounted in EU itself. The impact is really psychological and political because it's fundamental to the EU program, and psyche of one united Europe. And to let one country go out of that is, I think, anathema to a lot of people. So we'll see this week. Greece has been given until Thursday to come up with a set of programs. I'm not sure how the Prime Minister can come up with a set of programs in the context of what's just happened on Sunday in terms of the voting. But if things are okay and Greece carries on within the EU, it's a little bit of an uncertainty. People factor it in and life goes on. If for some reason, Greece is moved out of the EU, and I have no idea of knowing whether that will happen, what is the implication for the rest of us in the world economy? My own sense is after a brief shock, life will carry on. And particularly, I think it's in times like this that there is a flight to quality. And that is where I think, Singapore has always been seen as a place which is safe. Nobody is expecting a Greece in Singapore. And the dollar is strong, the government is stable, there are going to be no major changes in policy. Government doesn't borrow money, it runs a current account surplus every year. It's got reserves, and the land prices are stable. They're not going up, and transactions are not happening in the way many people in this room would like to see, but nor are they going like a yo-yo. And given that Singapore would be seen as a solid place, a place of quality, a place of where common sense prevails, and where money is treated well, including you invest your money in Singapore, it gets protected. There's a famous speech. Mr. Lee was the architect of Singapore, but he didn't do it alone. Dr. Goh was a crucial second chair in the system. And there is a beautiful, very short speech by Dr. Goh. And, I can never express it as well as he did. So I'll recommend that people go and look it up on the importance of treating money well. He says, money is abused in many countries by devaluation, by expropriation, and so on. We guarantee that in Singapore it will never be done. Your money will be looked after properly. So I think we would be all right. International economic situations will always impact on us, but we have sufficient internal confidence to brave it, just like 2008, 2009 financial economic great crisis, greatest crisis the world has seen since 1933. What happened in Singapore? The government came out with a $20 billion package, stabilized the system. People don't realize, what did our unemployment go to? 4%. That's all. So I'm not saying it's not important. International environment is absolutely important, but I think with the right measures, we'll be able to ride it out. Shanghai, the usual story in the sense that a stock market crash or a stock market going down so substantially may then impact on people's liquidity, on banks, on people's desire to invest or ability to invest, and it feeds itself. Ultimately, stock markets feed themselves into the real economy. You know the linkage. And when they feed into the real economy, and China is now number 1 or number 2 in terms of investments into this region and also in terms of trade, then it will have a real impact on the economies of all of us. That is an undeniable fact. and also on the ability or willingness of Chinese who wish to invest overseas. So that will have an impact as well, whether it's in the manufacturing sector or economic sector or property sector, their ability and willingness to invest will also be impacted. So I think you can expect a broad-based impact if, and I don't know, if there is a continuation of the process and if China's economy gets impacted. But by and large, the Chinese have shown themselves to be very good managers of the economy. You know, the last 20 years, every time you read something, someone is predicting a crash in China, and something is going to happen in China. We have never really believed in any of that. And each time the Chinese just wrote it out, they managed the economy well. This time round, we'll have to see how it happens and unfolds.
Thank you. Any question from the floor? Yes? Yeah, go to the mic and then tell us where you come from.
Hello, my name is Masami Shimizu. I'm from Japan. I'm a fellow and I work with Limex Japan. I'm sure, and actually everybody must be very sure that Singapore is one of the very successful on the financial and the commercial. So let me ask about something about the different things, about education, about the food. When I arrived in the Singapore airport, even in the midnight, I saw the many people eating the junk food at the burger, something like this. I'm sorry, I don't want to speak out the specific name, but I'm really personally interested in like a food education. I am trying to make by myself like a miso or like a Japanese pickles. How do you think those are things that the young people eating those junk food? Because Singapore also have the fantastic the local food, and everybody country has a nice food like chicken adobo in the Philippines. You know, we also have a great Japanese food. It's really healthy. So, sir, how would you like to think about those things, please?
Well, you see, unfortunately, there is an inverse correlation between how unhealthy the food is and how much one likes it.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
I mean, think of your food every day as boiled fish, boiled vegetables, very little rice, and make it brown rice. Don't put in any sugar. Don't put in any salt. Don't fry. No oil. And have 3 meals like that. You could lead a long life, but you'll probably be quite unhappy. So I think in all things moderation. It's, I mean, for a start, to eat after 8 o'clock at night is bad. So if you saw people, when you come in late, having food, and not just food, but junk food, then you know what it's going to do to their systems. Because your body needs a good night's rest to really clear itself. And at night, ideally, you should just have healthy vegetable soup, which is what I try to have, you know. But people's choices, people's tastes, I think we have to move towards greater education. For example, in our schools, we try now to introduce healthier choices. We try and remove or reduce the dependence on carbonated drinks, on sugared fizzy drinks. But there are limits to what governments can do. You know, you can't do this by dictate, and you can't do this by legislation. You have to educate. You have to make people be aware. And I entirely agree with your sentiments. And in a context where Singapore has just introduced universal healthcare insurance, where all of us are going to pool our premiums to pay for each other, you want everyone to try and move to a healthier lifestyle. Because otherwise, each one of our choices impacts on everybody else in terms of the cost to society. But it's got to move slowly. If you look at Singapore, you said Singapore has got great food. I was asked what do I like about Singapore food a few days ago. I could think of, we call it char kway teow, which is fried kway teow, a lot of oils. Say fried Hokkien mee. If you look at prawn noodle soup, I can tell you a few items. None of them will make it to a top 10 healthy lifestyle list. So you balance it, you exercise, sleep properly, eat a little bit, don't be too abstemious, but also don't overdo it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. May I ask some Suda Makang?
Pardon?
Suda Makang?
Suda?
What is that?
Makang.
Sorry, I can't make it out.
What is that you're saying?
Suda makan.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, Suda makan. Yeah.
Okay.
ありがとうございました。
Right. The Remax agent, maybe you want to bring her to our hawker centers. All right. You want to ask a question? Yes. Can you go to the mic? Okay. Thanks.
I'm here first.
Oh, you're here. Sorry. You first. Okay.
Good morning, and Minister for
Your
Foreign Affairs.
name?
My name is Thomas. I'm from a new agency called Wise Guru, being transferred from Unicorn already. Okay, there was an amusing question and answer. Singapore is a food paradise, but away from that topic this morning, I'd like to ask a question that is very personal to the Minister. As Foreign Affairs Minister, I think you travel a lot widely throughout ASEAN. And AEC is a big powerhouse with a population of 600 million. Earlier, you gave the answer on the effect of AEC on the whole ASEAN countries. But we have not heard a bit more details how our neighboring countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, which are our close neighbors with a very fast growth, will affect in some way our prices in Singapore. Would it drain out a lot of investment from Singapore going out to buy outside of Singapore? And will you put a control on that? Because there were a lot of news in the paper that even if an agent were to sell foreign properties, it's under CA jurisdiction. Thank you.
Well, there are two, I think, sub-questions in that. It's a very serious set of questions. The first is what happens when your neighbors grow very strongly? What happens to you? And second, does that mean that a lot of money will be sucked out of Singapore and go to the region? And would the government take steps? Put it this way. On the first question, in terms of growth, I think Malaysia is averaging 5.5%. Maybe it has potential to grow up a little bit more. Philippines has seen some years of good growth. Indonesia is looking at 6%. So compared with our 2-3%, yeah, they're growing much faster. And of course, they're growing much faster. Apart from Malaysia, Malaysia and Singapore's economy is almost the same size. But the other, Philippines is much smaller than Singapore's economy. Not a lot of people realize that. Of course, Indonesia's economy is bigger. In terms of economic size in ASEAN, it's Indonesia #1, Thailand #2, and either Malaysia or Singapore, which is #3. And Singapore's 3.2 million citizens and 500,000 permanent residents, plus 1+ million guest workers together combining at 5 million. The output, GDP output, is higher than the output of most of the other countries with much larger population, whether it's Vietnam or whether it's Philippines with 100 million people. But you can't expect that to remain the same. Inevitably, the size of the population and the resources are such that they will power ahead. That's because factors of production are population, land, capital. We don't have a problem with capital, but we have a problem with population, or we have a problem with land. And of course, we have no resources. So you must assume the others will power ahead of you. The question is, can you reinvent yourself for what we call quality growth? You know, have growth or small growth, but in a way that the population continues to move up. Now, that's going to be a tough challenge. It has other implications when your neighbors grow much faster than you on a whole series of other issues, which I don't need to go into here unless you want me to. Does that mean that money will be sucked out of Singapore? Look, the Singapore government believes in an open, free economy. You apply capital controls in an economy like Singapore, is it going to work? We depend on foreign direct investment. How much of our economy is based on the local economy? It's based on investments coming in. It's based on financial services. Even when the ASEAN economic community comes through, what are we hoping for? We hope to be the legal financial business sector for all of ASEAN. Do you do that by imposing financial controls? I think inevitably people will look in the neighboring countries regionally. Singaporeans took to investing in Japan in a big way last year because of the Japanese yen, Singapore dollar, and also the prices in Tokyo. So people are savvy. They will look for the best investments all around the world, and of course the region. And really it depends on us being attractive vis-a-vis others. You're not going to force people to invest in Singapore by making sure their money cannot go out. That's the surest way of disaster for Singapore.
Yeah, you want to ask a question, right?
Aloha. My name is Dano Sales. I own a brokerage in Hawaii, USA. And the last time I was here was in 1994. And when I pulled into town and down the very long boulevard with beautiful streets and see all your sky rises now and all the economic growth that is going on in Asia, and I look at the city as like a utopia, how have you been able to have this kind of growth and still control your carbon footprint, and how could that be replicated in other major growth cities with, you know, what's going on with, you know, so much in the climate in the world?
Thank you. I think it's a good question. It goes back to governance and what we can do in Singapore. You see, it's something that I've and many others have tried to apply our mind to quite a bit. The kind of things we have been able to do in Singapore. You don't go from $500 GDP per capita in 1965 to $65,000 in 2014 with just luck. The kind of things we have been able to do in Singapore, I think, quite frankly, are going to be difficult to do anywhere else in the world. Why do I say that? It's not rocket science. It is the ability of the government, with working in partnership with the people, to say, this is what Singapore needs next year, this is what it needs in 5 years, this is what it needs in 20 years, and this is what it needs in 30 years. Now, none of us can get it right about 20 years and 30 years, but at least you have a plan. For example, land use in Singapore, if you look at the plans, Prof will tell you, you can look at the master plans that are planned years ahead. Now, there can be changes, but somebody is applying their mind to, for example, long before climate change became an issue, Mr. Lee said, we need to build up our island above sea level. Long before. And more recently, we said, well, what he had decided, now that's costly because when you do anything, you've got to level up the land above sea level to a certain extent so that the rising waters don't impact on you. Now, he decided that in the 1970s. We decided that we wanted to go even higher, now at a considerable cost. But, you know, that kind of thinking, the kind of integration that goes on, the ability to acquire land, and even that, India had its constitution in 1947. We borrowed our constitution in 1965. Between 65 and 70, we developed our constitution. We borrowed from the Indian constitution. But Mr. Lee looked at it and said, you know, in the Indian constitution, right to property is a constitutional guarantee, which means anytime you want to acquire land, it's really part of the constitution and you've got to go to the Supreme Court to try and get it changed. Or you've got to amend the constitution, which are all impossible. He looked at it. He approached it from a very socialist perspective. Land is a scarce resource. We are 700, at that time 600 odd square kilometers, now we are 716 square kilometers. Very, very tiny. A lot of the land was owned by a few people. What do you want? If you want to make this place successful, you've got to industrialize. You're going to need land. You want to give people an identity. You've got to make sure they become property owning. No, those are radical ideas because nobody in 1960s thought in terms of everyone has got to own their own home. But that meant the government had to have the ability to acquire land easily and redevelop it according to a master plan and put in the infrastructure, identify industrial land, identify residential land, identify roads, what are all the different types of infrastructure. And this is a very small place, but a very highly complex organism. Land for defense. No city of this size thinks of its defense. We do. And 20% of our budget goes to defense. No city of this size has its own, full apparatus of state, of foreign affairs, defense, international relations, a whole variety of things. Hong Kong doesn't have any of this in those terms. So he said, I will not put property rights in the constitution. Now that required a lot of foresight. And he gave himself the power to acquire land, which is why 80% of our population is in housing which they own. Because he could acquire land, he could redevelop it, he could sell it. And the reason the population supported it is because, unlike almost every country in the post-colonial world, here we didn't acquire land and put it into our own pockets. People were very unhappy about the acquisition, the landowners, but everyone realized that when the government acquired the land, it went for a public purpose. It didn't go into Mr. Lee's pockets. That was a big difference. So they knew it was a not corrupt system, it was a fair system, and we acquired a huge amount of land. We redeveloped the entire island according to a master plan. It's like starting on a green field. That ability to do greenfield across existing structures is, I think, impossible to achieve in most places. The moment you try and touch any existing structure in any city in the world, you will get a big political fight, you will get a big legal fight, and it will be impossible for the city council to do anything. You can do a bit of carpentry here and there. You can't remodel the place. And so that ability to remodel, divide it up equitably, and at the same time, that alone would have been completely useless unless you had good economic growth, so that people were able to buy properties and make the place a metropolis so that property values were sustained, economic growth was sustained. So when you come in, you see Marina Bay, you see the financial center, you see millions of square feet of commercial land being taken up, being used. It's not empty buildings. So that's that kind of ability to get things done is, it's not that we are smarter than anybody else. It's simply that the political system and the support of the people here and the fact that the government was reasonably confident that the people will support what it did and will re-elect it were crucial factors. If you had to worry, is this going to cost me the elections? Then not a lot of good things can be done.
So it's got to do with political leadership, Is that because of the time constraint? Oh, there's one question, yes?
Good morning, sir. Good morning, sir. This is Robin. I'm a KEO in one of the Remax Singapore franchise. With consideration that most of the people here are KEOs, brokers, salespersons from Singapore and foreign countries, what advice would you give to us, with the increased activity in cross-border selling and activities?
I think I've covered that earlier. I said, in my own view, if you talk about cross-border, of course, I start from a macroeconomic perspective. I look at the GDP of the country, I look at the political leadership, and I look at the factors of stability. I look at economic growth, and then I say, are prices on an uptrend or downtrend? Or are they going to be stable? Now, assuming that there is economic growth and there is some sort of stability, unfortunately, there's a second question that needs to be asked, which is, can the political system interfere with property rights in an unfair way? And you ask those questions, and then you know which jurisdictions you can invest in.
Besides investing,
yes.
In the course of our work, as a salesperson, is there any advice on the pitfalls, specifically to the area of our work that, you would advise?
Can you be a bit more specific?
We have got, different countries has got, different regulations. Like in Singapore, it's heavily regulated by CEA. So, we do have got different systems, in the, if you consider, our work itself. So, there's a huge gap actually, how we're going to conduct business. So I'm not sure whether if you can, in your capacity as
we don't regulate how you do business elsewhere. And even the CEA, you talk about heavy regulation, it's a fairly recent invention. In the past, we didn't regulate, right? We left it free, we could do what you want, and we assumed the market will take care of itself. And then what happened? There were increasing number of complaints, people were unhappy, and the government was forced to move because many agents were professional, but there are always some who are not professional, and the few who are not professional, as a member of parliament, I see residents who come to me. Residents' literacy, financial literacy, and understanding can be very mixed, can be very varied. And these are, sometimes you feel a lot of pity for them. They come, they tell you, they are in their 50s or 60s. They were promised that, if they sell this, then they can buy that. And in between, the money just disappears. Or they were left high and dry because they didn't know the rules and they cannot buy that. And the agent has disappeared with a significant sum of the money. And, they look at you and they say, what do I do? Now, what do you tell them? This is the free market and you made a wrong choice of agent. But your government can't keep saying that. If it becomes serious enough, and a few years ago it became serious enough, then we had to say there needs to be some sort of framework. And I'm happy to discuss CEA at some point in time. I know the CEA and the agents have talked to us about CEA, and we have asked and made suggestions to MND for CEA to change some of its approaches and frameworks. And there is an ongoing discussion between the agencies and CEA, mediated by some of the officials and ministers. It's very difficult as a foreign minister to go and comment on the countries around the region or even the further region. All I can say is and I know.
All right, thank you, sir.
Okay, yeah. Perhaps I could suggest this has got to do with training and education. And Ken Lim just now signed the MOU, There's your Real Estate International Academy could provide that kind of training for the REMAX agents and others who require it.
Hello.
Okay, this will be the last question,
one?
all right, because of time constraint.
All right, so
yes.
it's my pleasure to having a last question in big honor. So my name is Mukto Sheng. I'm from Mongolia, and then we are very first region in Remax system in the family. So I have a question about how Asian Pacific, even the Singapore investors think about Mongolia, because we have one of the biggest mining industries still processing in the next few years. So it's gonna be the big investments for the mining in Mongolia. It's always bringing the big amount of money. It's also bringing a lot of the commercial, residential people who's working there. They're living in the around area, mining area. So what do you think about Pacific Asian, even the Singapore investments people think about and then knowledge about Mongolia?
Thank you for that question. You see, as a foreign minister, I have a little bit more knowledge about Mongolia. I've met your previous foreign minister. I know a little bit. But say the person who doesn't have to do the job that I'm doing, unless they've got a business interest in Mongolia, I think the relative knowledge of Mongolia in Singapore would not be that high, particularly on the real estate sector. If you look at the way people invest, normally they know their own place reasonably well, then they will know the region, and then they will know countries based on cultural or historical connections. There is a fair bit of investment from Singaporeans into the United Kingdom, for example, in London. Why? Because of the historical connection. And in the US, now because a lot of Singaporeans are educated in the United States. In Australia, also because they understand Australia. And of course, UK, Australia, US are all seen as transparent systems, stable currency. And though I noticed the Australian dollar is almost the same as the Singapore dollar from today's newspapers, when it was 130 or 120. And you remember the time when it was $3 or $4. But, it's stable and good. And even if you don't get 5% a year or 10% a year growth, you know that your money is safe and it's a good place to invest. I mean, that's the idea people have. And more recently, for cultural and by reason of cultural historical connections, people have started looking at investing in China for obvious reasons, India, and so on. So I would say Mongolian real estate, underpinned by your commodities and natural resources, is something you will have to sell to the Singaporean market. Japan was not an obvious market for Singaporeans because they didn't really understand Japan, but then that position changed because Japan has all the same factors. It's a good economy, it's a stable place, it's a good place to invest. You know your money will not be lost, as in nobody is going to come and take it away from you. It might go up and down based on economic reasons, but not because it's basically it's not an acquisitive place. They don't come and just take it away from you. So that helped. I think Japan became very attractive. So I would say it depends on what your agency makes of it, what the Singapore agents make of it, and bringing that market to the understanding of Singaporeans. And people invest where they believe they can get the best returns. Yeah.
Thank you. I think, unfortunately, of course, this is a very interesting discussion we can carry on, but because of the time constraint, we have to put this to a close. Thank you very much for all the questions, and particularly I'd like to thank the ministers for taking his busy time off, just to share with us some of the insight, experience, and knowledge. Can I invite all of you to join me to show our appreciation to the ministers?
Thank you. Thank you.